Alrighty, hello everybody. My name is Antonio Sarzi, and today I'm going to be talking about Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time. I apologize for not having a video right now, but you can sure to know that I am here and I am alive and my voice is okay. So, anyways, let's get started with this piece. Messiaen was a little bit of backstory about Messiaen. So, Messiaen was born in 1908, excuse me. And during this time, he lived through the First World War. And when the second came around, he was drafted by the French, and so became a nurse. And for all you that know about what happened to the French in World War One, they got shellacked by the Germans, and so they got beaten badly because they were decimated by World War One. I mean, their entire countryside was decimated during the war, and the population had not really come back from that, and they were not ready to fight, and so Messiaen was a nurse from 1939 to 1940 when he was captured during the Germans' Blitzkrieg to the coast, and so he was captured and sent to a prison camp that was in Nancy, and then he was moved to a camp called uh, Stalag 7A, and so this camp was this camp is now in was now part of Germany, and so he was in. We'll just say he was in German lines when he was a prisoner, and so during his time at the temporary camp in Nancy, he met a clarinetist and a cellist whose names I'm not going to try to pronounce because I will brutalize them, and they deserve better than that. He met with them and became great friends, and they pushed him to write this piece. And so, with by help of befriending some of the guards, Messiaen was able to acquire manuscript paper. And so, with that, Messiaen was sent to the permanent camp, Stalag, and he met the violinist there. His first name is Jean, and so he had a quartet that was ready, and then they all pushed him to continue writing this during their times of monotony and terror of what may or may not happen to them. And so this was relatively early in the war, so that Germany had the ability to feed their prisoners, per se. So we there was great fear of what may happen to them, but probably not as well founded as in later in the war. And so, but anyways, besides that point, Messiaen wrote this throughout the winter of 40 of throughout the winter of 1940 and finished the piece in 1941. And so with this, Messiaen was very much into the untraditional in writing music, per se. He was very much he called himself he was self-professed as a composer rhythmicist, and so he really loved to use prime number time signatures, and maybe not even time signatures at all, but very blunt and syncopated rhythms. Excuse me, syncopated rhythms, and was very much fond of unison or kind of homophobic. Oops, homophobic textures, per se. Not the fear of homosexual people, but the single, unison textures, one single texture, not polyphonic textures. But this piece did use a lot of unison and also polyphonic textures. But Messiaen really wanted to leave time out of the way, and he based this quartet off of Revelations 1 or Revelations chapter 10 verse 1 and verse 10. And while during this time he these these verses, excuse me, I'm not all here this morning, I guess. Um it reads, I saw still another mighty angel coming down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was on his head. His face was like the sun, and his feet like pillars of fire. Okay, that's verse 1. So basically, the angel's here to decree what God has said. And in verse 6, the angel said, and swear by him that liveth forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that therein are, and the earth and the things that therein are, and the sea, and the things which are in the sea, that there should be time no longer. So Messiaen was really in this class of, he didn't want a structured time. He really wanted to move away from that. And you really see this in his 8 movement quartet. And I say again, 8 movements. It is a doozy, to say the least. Not as long as a Schubert, but probably a little bit more interesting, to say the least. And so the 8 movements are really they're based off of the scriptures, and so it's really funny because some of these movements are just solos. Like the third movement, it's called the Abyss of the Birds, is a clarinet solo, and it's about the abyss, and so he characterizes the abyss as time itself, with its sadness and tendiums, and so the bird, and so he people describes it as like the birds are the opposite of time, and that the birds desire wherever they go, and they go wherever, and they just pour out these songs and stuff like that don't have time in them, the time that we see it in Western classical music. And then we have the last movement, the 8th movement, which is a violin solo. And the violin solo is an expansive solo. And I will get into the 5th movement, which is the cello solo. But the 8th movement is titled Praise to the Immortality of Jesus. And so this movement really balances the cello in the 5th movement. And this movement is more of a glorification than the 5th movement towards Jesus, of course. And so the immortality of him, that he is not the immortality of Jesus, that he is not bound by time as we are in classical music, or in life in general. And so the 5th movement, it's a cello solo, praises the eternity of Jesus. And so Jesus here is described as one with the Word. And so basically it goes back to the Gospel of John, where it talks about the Word talks about, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so the Word is always there and is infinite, eternal, per se. And so it's a very slow movement for the cello, and it's very much in line of the Word is everlasting and is mighty, right? And just because the cello is mighty in its stature and its ability to be all over the spectrum. And so with that, there was a concert held on Wednesday, January 15th, 1941, And there are conflicting accounts of the concert. Messiaen, who may have a bit of narcissism in him, of course, and self-indulgence, believes that he was paid, that people, up to 5,000 people showed up and watched him. Well, the cellist believes that there was only about 400 people that showed up. And that Messiaen believed that the cellist was playing with 3 strings, and the cellist said, no, I was playing with all 4 strings. So I will defer my judgment with the 3 to 4 strings on the cellist, because I think a cellist would know if he was playing with 3 strings or not. And so it was bitterly cold that day. But disregarding whose account is correct and who is maybe exacerbated, everybody was moved in the camp, and there were both French and Germans that were watching. And the newspaper writes that he says in this, we felt just the same tumultuous and partisan atmosphere of some premieres, latent as much with passionate acclaim as with anger and denunciation. And there was, of course, there's always tension during premieres, but this was done in a POW camp, and the Germans were in line with the Geneva Conventions at this time, but there is a tension between the prisoners and the guards, just because they're enemies, they're war enemies. But it goes on to be a massive success, this newsletter calls it a masterpiece. And that, even though it was the good fortune of the camp to be able to hear this piece, it was just strange, because you have this tumultuous time that they're in, and yet there's just a moment of silence between the audience and the performers at the end. And so this piece is as the Chicago Symphony Orchestra describes it, it's an act of faith. And so an act of faith that time is not an illusion per se, but that there's something outside of time that we can all strive for, even in music itself, and that we can all get away from the structure of time and just live outside of it like God does. Because God doesn't live within the confines of time. And so, with that being said, Messiaen lived a long time. He was born in 1908, and he died in 1992 in France. And so he was one of the most influential composers of the 20th century, and rightfully so. And he had to live through some hardship, but in that hardship grew a masterpiece for all of us to listen to. So, with that being said, thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk more soon. Thanks.